A place where a spoon still waits for the one who never came back. Every morning in Wind Hollow, old Jed Harper would set 6 spoons on the wooden table, lined up neatly as if someone might still return. But the seasons had turned many times, and no one ever did. The townsfolk called him the one who survived the plague. But really, he was just the one who hadn't died. No one came to visit, no one asked questions. His cabin sat quiet in the wind and dust, filled with noises no one could name. Until one market day when folks gathered at a bare patch of land, not to buy, but to watch. A woman stood still, gray dress worn thin, hands clutching a bundle of cloth. Behind her, 5 children, the oldest holding the youngest's hand, the youngest looking down, as if hiding the sound of a hungry belly. No one called out a price. But the way the crowd looked, it was bargaining enough. Jed didn't step forward, didn't ask how much. He just looked at the smallest child shivering, and dropped a pouch of coins onto the wooden platform, like someone laying a stone on a grave, not out of pity, but because he couldn't walk away. From that day on, 6 silent shadows followed him home. No words of thanks, no promises. They didn't speak of the past, didn't demand a future. But the spoons washed clean again. The clothes mended without a word. Slowly built something unspoken, yet visible to all. No one here was alone anymore. And then, on a misty morning when the youngest tugged at his coat and whispered, "Pa," Jed didn't answer. He just nodded, as if he'd waited his whole life to hear that one word. Part 1. Only he knew he was still here. On a stretch of barren land at the edge of Wind Hollow stood a crooked wooden house, leaning slightly westward, where the wind blew from dawn till dusk. There was no proper fence, no nameplate by the door, just a dusty front step and the creaking sound of a broken windmill blade each evening. Jed Harper lived there alone, like the leftover of something bigger, a storm, a farewell, or a sorrow no one dared to name. People in town called him the survivor, but Jed had never agreed with that word. He wasn't living, he was just still breathing. Each morning Jed rose early. He lit the stove with dry birch from last season, then brewed coffee in a dented chipped iron kettle. After that, he set the table, always for 6. The table sat beside the window, looking out onto the prairie, where the grass no longer grew green and the sky forgot when to rain. 6 spoons, neatly arranged, knives always pointed inward, tin cups wiped clean and flipped upside down, only to be turned right side up when it was time to pour. No one sat at the table, but he still laid it out. Some mornings Jed poured 2 cups of coffee, one to drink, one just to place there. No one ever touched it, but still, he poured, perhaps because it made the table feel less empty, or maybe because he wasn't ready to accept that 6 cups were too many for one man. People knew Jed had once had a family, a wife named Lorna, quiet, fond of peppermint tea, a son named Toby, hair curled like summer sheep's wool. The yellow fever took them both in 4 nights. The funeral happened in the rain. Since then, Jed had stopped going to church, stopped visiting the saloon, didn't attend another town meeting, but his stove still lit up every morning. He still wrote down grocery lists, still oiled his old rifle, still replaced the chains on the horse trough, as if someone might return at any moment, as if he were only keeping the house for someone else, not living in it himself. That morning, as mist mixed with dust, Jed stepped onto the porch with a lukewarm cup of coffee. The sky hadn't broken light yet. Out by the fence, a lone sparrow perched and nodded once, then flew off. The wind was gentle, nothing unusual. Jed walked back inside and opened the drawer by the stove. He took out a whittling knife he used to carve wooden horses for Toby. The blade was dull now, but his hand still remembered how to hold it. He ran his thumb along the spine, not enough to bleed, just enough to make sure he could still feel. The house was quiet, same as always. He looked over at the 6 chairs. One of them used to creak whenever Toby swung his legs. Now it was silent. Jed exhaled, slow, without words. But if someone had been there to hear it, they might have understood it to mean, if someone would just sit down, they wouldn't have to say anything. That'd be enough. That morning, Jed shaved. He looked in the mirror longer than usual. Not because he saw something strange, but because he wasn't used to looking without flinching. He put on a weathered white shirt, knotted a brown scarf, and wore his oilcloth coat patched at the elbows. After fastening the last button, he stood silently at the door, looking at the sky, the dirt, the way dust hung midair without falling. Then he mounted his horse, didn't say a word, didn't look back. He carried only a list. New reins, rock salt, a bar of soap, and maybe something he hadn't written yet. The market was setting up beyond the center of town, where the dirt was still fresh, and on that very same morning, amidst the shouting vendors and heels clacking on wooden boards, there stood a woman, with 5 children, and when Jed looked toward them, not at her, but at the smallest child, trembling, a new story quietly began, one that needed no words. Part 2. No one sells people, but people still get sold. The Wind Hollow Market sat in the middle of a clay-packed square, once the communal hitching post for homesteaders a generation ago. Later, folks added awnings and nailed down wooden platforms. Easier to display goods that way. And just like that, it became a market on days like today, when the sun wasn't too harsh and the wind didn't bite. The scent of sweat mingled with dry grass and bruised apples. Locals gathered to trade anything measurable by lac: flour, rusted knives, 2 big boots, or a saddle worn thin, and sometimes people. No one hung a sign that said, "For sale, people." No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. The way that woman stood, without goods, without buying, in the very center of the square, 5 children huddled close behind her like wind-beaten weeds. That said enough. The horse seller muttered, "Miner's widow. Husband died last month. No one claimed the body. Bank took the house." The rope vendor added, "She's been to other towns. No one took 'em. Kids follow her like pups. But look at those backs, straighter than mine ever were." The salt man just spat tobacco and shook his head. Used to be Martin's woman. Worked in the quarry, died underground. No will left. They say the mine never recognized her as legal wife. Now they call her unclaimed property. Any papers? No. Anyone willing to vouch? No. And just like that, a person became an item, because no one remembered her name, and no one cared to. The midday wind lifted yellow dust into the folds of her dress. Marion stood tall, clutching her youngest, who didn't cry, only buried their face into her belly, as if by not seeing they wouldn't be taken. The other 4 stood behind her like a fence made of people, patched, tired, but still upright. No one begged, no hands reached out, just a small wooden sign, tilted beside them, charcoal scrawled in a rough hand. Widow. 5 children will work, not to be split. One clear message, as if telling the whole town, we don't separate, no matter what you offer. And maybe that's why, from morning to noon, no one approached. People wanted the oldest. He could chop wood. The youngest, easy to boss. The mother, only without the baggage. No one wanted all 6, so they stood there, like goods still wrapped, seen by all, yet avoided by all. Up on the auction platform, the main caller started to grow impatient. He slapped the board harder with each call, as if that might magically turn the lot into hens or rams. Lot 12, 5 boys strong, straight backs good for labor. A few heads shook. No splits. Must take all. Silence. Widow included. Can cook, clean, tend elders. A middle-aged man barked, I'll take the oldest. He looks handy with an axe. Another grunted, that little one's easy to order around. The others look wild. Can't feed that. She didn't turn, didn't speak, just tightened her arms around the boy, as if telling the whole marketplace, we're one, not for sale by parts. There were scoffs, a few snorts. Someone muttered, stubborn fool! And then, in the noise of dust and judgment, came the sound of hooves from the far end of the market. An older man, cloak dusty, gloves worn, stopped his horse right in front of the group. He didn't ask anything, didn't smile, but he didn't look at the woman. He was looking at the youngest, at the way the child hid their face in wrinkled cloth, as if by being still enough, small enough, the world might forget they existed. Jed Harper sat motionless in the saddle, but inside, something had just shifted. Part 3. He didn't look at her. He looked at the trembling child. Jed Harper didn't dismount right away. He sat tall in the saddle, reins in hand, as if still weighing a decision. But deep down, he already knew. He'd known from the moment he saw the flicker of fear in the child's eyes peeking out from under his mother's skirt. That small shiver, it wasn't from the wind. It was from something children shouldn't learn so young. The feeling of being looked at like you were something to be priced. Jed had seen that look before, in Toby's eyes. His boy's eyes the night he coughed so hard, his lips turned blue yet still asked, Pa, are you scared? Jed hadn't answered, and after that, Toby never asked again. The auctioneer slammed his hand harder on the board. Lot 12, widow, 5 boys, take all. His voice was dry as splintered wood. The crowd began to drift. Some shook their heads, some chuckled. The curious stretched their necks but didn't move closer. No split, someone muttered. Then forget it. Another snorted, spitting into the dirt. Stubborn bitch'll starve 'em all. Marion didn't turn around. She didn't need to see their faces. She just needed to feel her arms still wrapped around her youngest, and that the 4 behind her stood tall, like wooden fence posts in rainy season, old, brittle, but still standing. Jed tied his horse to a post and walked towards the platform. Each step pressed mud to his boots. But he didn't rush. No one rushed at market unless they were hungry for coin. When he reached the front, Marion lifted her head. For the first time. The man before her was tall, weathered, carrying the weight of someone who didn't ask for sympathy and wouldn't accept it. His eyes weren't harsh, just tired, the kind of tired that comes from having seen enough loss to know. Sometimes just standing still is the kindest thing you can do. They didn't greet. No handshake. Jed looked straight at her and asked, in a voice deep as dry oak, "What's your name?" Marion hesitated, not out of reluctance, but because her name felt weightless, now stripped of meaning in a place that had no use for it. "Marion," she said softly. "Marion Hale." Jed nodded, then looked to the children. "They yours?" She pressed her lips. "They're all I have left." He nodded again, slower this time. His hand went into his coat pocket, came back with a thick, well-folded bundle of notes. Old and ready, as if saved for something long overdue. Jed didn't look at the auctioneer, didn't ask for price, didn't bargain. He just raised the money and kept his eyes on Marion. "I'll take them all." Silence cracked open like water hitting broken bricks. Someone chuckled. Another whispered, "Old man's lost his damn mind." Someone yelled, "All 6? What for? Opening a damn orphanage." Jed didn't answer, didn't need to. Marion didn't speak either. But when she looked down at her children and gave the faintest nod, the boys followed her without needing to be pulled, for the first time in weeks. Jed turned and walked out of the market, not as someone driving cattle, but upright, without shame. A half-drunken voice called after him, "You marrying her too, old man? Or is it just an hourly hire?" Jed didn't look back, neither did Marion, but when she climbed into the wagon, she set the smallest child on her lap and tied the belts for the other three herself, without being asked. And as Jed mounted his horse, eyes fixed on the dusty road westward, he knew, though no one said a word, that from now on there'd be 6 spoons to wash after every supper. Part 4. They left the market with no congratulations, no understanding. The wagon pulled away from the square, while behind them the market's shouts still echoed. It never remembered who came and cared even less who left, unless they left behind debt or gossip. Jed Harper held the reins, upright in his saddle, and never once looked back. His old horse pulled the rickety wooden wagon past the hitching post. Its wheels splashed through muddy puddles, splattering Marion's dress. She didn't brush it off. In the back of the wagon, 6 souls sat close, but none touched. Jesse sat near the rear, eyes never leaving Jed's back. Eli stared at his own fingers, as if they'd just done something wrong. Caleb and Sam sat quietly, each clutching a small cloth sack that held everything they owned. A chipped dinner knife, a scrap of blanket, and a book with no cover. Matthew, the youngest, sat curled on his mother's lap, his face buried in her gray dress. Wet from rain, dusty from dirt, as if it was the last safe place he knew. Marion didn't ask where Jed was taking them. She only gripped the drawstring of the small fabric pouch hanging by her side. Not heavy, but the last thing that belonged to her alone. A spool of thread, a pair of scissors, and a bent silver spoon. No one spoke for a long stretch of road. The path from Wind Hollow to Jed's ranch wound through red dirt and low hills, past sparse trees and patches of wild grass. The rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung low. The wind slipped through the wagon's canvas flaps, down shirt collars, and into the silence between the children. A cough, a boot scraped wood, but still, no words. Jed kept the horse at a steady pace, eyes forward, grip on the reins loose, as if tightening them might make him think twice. Once, when the wagon jolted over a stone, Jesse grabbed the side and whispered, "Where's he taken us?" Eli glanced over. Marion placed her hand gently on Jesse's leg, and he fell quiet. Jed heard, said nothing. By late afternoon, they reached the ranch gate. Not a real gate, just 2 posts marking the dirt path. To the left stood the main house, white paint faded, tin roof bowed like an old mule's spine. To the right, the barn, hayshed, and a hand-crank well. Jed dismounted and opened the wagon door. She didn't wait to be invited. Marion stepped down first, Matthew in her arms, eyes scanning the place like someone returning to somewhere they used to be inspected. Jesse jumped down next, eyes still fixed on Jed, then Eli, then Caleb, and Sam. They stood in a line, not because they were told, but because it felt natural, like fence posts that had leaned beside each other long enough to know their place in silence. Jed pointed toward the house. "Go on." Marion hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, so soft the wind nearly carried it away. "It's just for now. We won't need much." Jed didn't answer. He just watched the 6 of them pass through the doorway, like ghosts slipping back into a memory he once had. Then he turned, walked toward the stable. There was supper to make, a horse to unsaddle, and maybe, just maybe, a cold stove waiting for fire again. Part 5. The woman didn't beg for charity, she just asked for a roof. Evenings fell faster on the outskirts of Wind Hollow than folks remembered. The sun never stayed long enough to warm the grass, and the shadows cast by the stable stretched far, like they were trying to hold the whole prairie in place. When Jed returned from the back lot, his coat smelling of old straw and the sweat of an aging mule, the porch already held new footprints, muddy, half-dried, scattered like the lives that had just arrived. The front door stood ajar. It never locked, never had. Inside, the space still wasn't used to people. 6 chairs, 6 cups, a black iron stove with peeling paint in the corner, and a table Jed had built 2 winters ago, back when he wasn't sure anyone would sit at it again. Marion stood by the kitchen counter. She wasn't snooping through cupboards, wasn't rifling through tins like someone desperate. She just stood there, one hand resting on the worn wood, shoulders tilted slightly as if she were listening. To the house breathe, to floorboards creak, to the faint echo of rain caught in the tin roof. Jed didn't speak. Matthew sat on the chair nearest the stove, hugging his knees. The older boys were scattered. Jesse stood by the door, watching the yard. Eli crouched, inspecting his cloth bag. Sam and Caleb took in the room, their eyes cautious, like they'd be scolded for touching something they shouldn't. "We won't stay long," Marion said, softly. "Just a few nights. Once the rain clears, I'll find someplace else." Jed took off his coat, hung it by the door, brushed the dust, not to clean it, but because it was habit. "You've got 6 people who need rest," he said. "Stay." That simple answer, unexpected, unadorned, made Marion still for a long moment, as if listening not to him, but to every locked door and turned-away face that came before. "We'll work," she said more firmly now. "I can cook, sew, wash. The boys, each one knows their way around a chore." Jed nodded, then walked to the small room on the right, pulled out a few old blankets and laid them near the chairs. He didn't assign them, didn't direct. Marion understood. She called the children over, divided the blankets, picked their corners, without asking if it was allowed. That night the stove lit up again. No one laughed out loud. No one talked much. But there was the sound of food sizzling, of spoons scraping pots, of bowls clinking softly. And for the first time in a long while, the house smelled like people were living. Before supper, Marion washed the 6 spoons. She didn't ask why there were already 6, didn't question it, just dried each one carefully and set them on the table, in the right places, facing the right way, as if she'd been doing it all her life. Jed saw it, but said nothing. After the meal, Jesse stacked chairs. Eli gathered dishes. Sam carried the water pot outside. No one told them to. No one had to. Marion lingered at the table a while, her fingers tracing the curve of a spoon before placing it back exactly where it was. She looked up. The wind whispered through the porch. Jed's shadow stretched across the wall, long and still. No one called this place home. But that night, under a sagging roof, in a room no one thought could feel warm again, 6 people slept peacefully, and 1 man didn't eat alone anymore. Part 6, each child looked at him differently. Mornings in Wind Hollow didn't start with roosters, but with the slow silver shift of light across the windowsill. A soft grayness settled over the table, clung to unwashed sleeves, and spilled across the floor where small muddy feet had once passed. Jed Harper woke before the sun crested the eastern ridge. He stepped off the bed, the wooden floor giving a quiet groan beneath his heel. Cold air slid through the cracks in the door, the scent of dirt, ash, and a bit of smoke still lingering from last night's fire. In the kitchen, no one was awake, but signs told him someone had been. A kettle sat on the stove, embers beneath it still warm. A basket of damp potatoes waited on the side. and the dishcloth he'd left crumpled had been folded neatly placed by his tin cup. Marion, no note, no words, just gestures, tidier than any spoken thanks. Jed pulled on his coat and stepped into the yard, starting the morning with the trough and water line. When he came back, a quiet scene greeted him. Jessie stood at the doorway, shoulder leaning against the frame, holding a broom longer than he was tall. He didn't greet Jed, but when Jed stepped onto the porch, the boy shifted slightly, making room like he'd always lived there. Eli sat farther out, near the fence by the well. He held a rusted pocket knife, shaving down a piece of wood, its purpose unclear, but his hand showed he'd done this before. What made Jed pause wasn't the knife, but the look. Eli didn't look at Jed like someone to be wary of, nor like someone expecting rules or reproach. He looked at him like someone looks at an old tree, wondering which way it might fall when the wind comes. No one said anything. Jed nodded. Eli nodded back. Slow, steady, not a greeting, not permission, just a quiet acknowledgement. I see you, and you see me. That whole day, the 6 strangers settled into the land. No one assigned tasks, no chores were spoken, but each child, in their own way, began leaving footprints across unfamiliar soil. Caleb and Sam dug through the old firewood pile, playing a silent game with no winner or loser, just something to keep their hands busy and their hearts from echoing. Jesse cleaned the window. The glass was scratched, but he kept wiping. Small circles, patient. When Jed passed by, Jesse paused. Waiting, maybe, but Jed said nothing. So the boy continued, this time slower, more sure. Matthew, the youngest, disappeared for half the morning. No one found him until Marion spotted him, curled beneath the porch steps, arms wrapped around a hunk of firewood like a stuffed toy. He wasn't sleeping, just lying there, eyes open, staring into space. Not crying, not speaking, just breathing, like he was practicing how to be at peace. By late afternoon, Marion was tidying the kitchen. She didn't ask whose things were whose. She followed scent and silence, wiped where dust had settled longest, scrubbed where grease had grown thick, not out of gratitude, not as repayment, but because she understood. If you've walked under a roof, leave a mark made of neatness, not noise. At sunset, Jed sat on the porch with a cold tin cup of coffee. In the yard, the children were gathered. Caleb and Sam scratching lines in the dirt, Jesse lining stones into rows, Eli still whittling. At some point, Matthew had crept behind Jed, so quietly even the wind hadn't noticed. The child didn't speak, just placed a small nut, the kind that dropped after a hard wind, beside Jed's foot on the porch step, then sat, hands on his knees, eyes forward. Jed didn't ask. Matthew didn't explain. And they sat there, 2 shadows stretching side by side in the fading light, one large, one small, not touching but facing the same way. Sometimes a presence doesn't need a name. It only needs to be to remind you you're no longer entirely alone. Part 7, he didn't teach. He just said, that grip will hurt. That morning, the mist still clung to the grass in the front yard. Jed had gone out to the barn to fix an old hinge, the one that squeaked every time the wind pushed through. While dragging out the box of nails, he noticed Jesse struggling with a hammer larger than his forearm. The boy tried to steady it, but his fingers kept slipping down the handle, the head swinging loose and dangerous. Jed didn't speak right away. He stepped up behind Jesse, close enough to hear the boy breathe, and without a word, without reprimand, he reached down, took the boy's wrist, and adjusted his grip. 3 fingers firm, thumb away from the metal. That grip'll hurt, he said, soft, like he was saying it to himself. Then he stood up and walked away, leaving Jesse with the hammer and the half-driven nails. No praise, no further instruction. But Jesse paused. He looked at his hand. The first time he'd been touched by a grown man without pain, without shouting, without shame. That touch didn't teach a skill. It taught something else, that you could be wrong and still be corrected without being broken. That evening, when Jed returned from the field, he found his heavy coat, the one with frayed shoulders and a tear at the elbow, hanging neatly on the barn door. A patch had been stitched near the left shoulder, not neatly. The thread was uneven, the stitching clumsy. A long strand curled around the button. No one claimed credit. Marion was washing a basin under the moonlight, hands wet. Jesse sat on the porch, eyes on the stars. Jed didn't ask, didn't put the coat on right away. He just reached out, ran his fingers over the patch, his thumb brushing the uneven thread, like someone stroking a quiet apology, too shy to speak. In the West, men often believed gratitude had to be loud, paid in bullets, land, or sweat. But in this house, some debts were answered with a coat, stitched clumsily, and warm enough to survive another wind season. The next morning, Jed didn't go back to the barn right away. He hammered 2 nails into the beam near the kitchen door, then walked inside. No words, only Jesse, peeking from behind the wall, saw him do it. And when Jed disappeared into the house, Jesse blinked, not from the dust, but because his fingers had just gripped the hammer again, this time the right way. And in that quiet moment, no smiles, no thanks, something between them had been fastened in place by a blow that didn't bruise. Part 8. One word made the whole porch hold its breath. That morning the fog was thick, like steam over a cup of warm milk. Outside, the prairie was still asleep. Inside, the porch creaked under the first footsteps of the day. Jed set a kettle on the coal stove, then went to open the chicken coop. Everything felt as it always did, quiet, slow, no one asking anything of anyone. Marion was washing a basket at the trough. Her gray skirt hitched at the hip, hands dipped in cold water. Her eyes drifted somewhere beyond, perhaps to the stream at the edge of the field, perhaps just anywhere that wasn't the past. The children began to stir. Bare feet skimmed across the porch, a soft clunk. Someone tripped over a floorboard. Then a voice, not loud, not clear, just a murmur, quieter than the morning dove. Pa. Jed froze in the yard. His hand, reaching for the hoe, stopped midair. Marion froze too, her hands stiff at the washcloth. The final drop of water from her skirt hit the earth with a sound too clear, as if something had just been named that could no longer be hidden. No one said anything else. Jed didn't turn around, didn't rush to the boy, didn't nod right away. He only looked toward the small shadow standing in the mist. Matthew, the youngest, the one who left nuts beside Jed's chair, the one who rarely spoke, who tugged at his mother's sleeve when he was afraid. Jed turned slowly, walked back to the stove. The kettle began to hiss. He picked up an extra tin cup, set it on the table to his left. Not to the right. The right had always been where another man once sat, years ago. This cup wasn't for a guest, wasn't for Marion, and wouldn't be put away after breakfast. He filled it with warm water, let it sit, then lifted his own cup and sat down on the porch, as he did every morning. Marion didn't step forward, but she watched. For the first time, she looked at Jed, not with suspicion, not as someone borrowing shelter, not with the hesitation of one owing a kindness she hadn't asked for. She looked as if, in the fog and the rising steam, something had just named this family without a single document signed. No one questioned it. No one told the boy not to say it. But from that moment on, the word Pa stayed. It didn't run in the blood, wasn't born in a mother's womb. It was born on a morning when a child dared to name what he hoped for, and a man stayed silent just long enough to let him believe it was safe to do so. Part 9. The man from Carson came with laws, papers, and a narrow gaze. The sun didn't shine that morning, but the air felt drier than usual, as if the land itself sensed someone was coming with things that didn't belong here, but would be brought anyway. A four-wheeled carriage creaked up the red gravel road from Carson. The horses looked worn, the man even more so. Long coat, black felt hat, soft gloves. Everything about him was tidy, like it had been stored in a drawer, and just as cold from being left there too long. Jed was mixing feed near the barn. At the sound of wheels crunching gravel, he merely turned his head. Beside him, the old shovel, worn, cracked, but still upright, stood like the one thing in the place that had never moved. The man stepped down, brushed off his coat hem, pulled a stack of papers from a leather satchel. His eyes scanned the yard. Not a hint of greeting in them. Marion was rinsing a bucket at the well. When she saw the stranger's wagon, she froze. The children clustered behind the window. Not one of them ran out like they usually did. The man spoke, voice clipped and practiced, like he'd memorized it from a law book. I am an authorized representative from the Carson office, per the petition filed by the late Mr. Hill's kin, Mrs. Marion Hill, is to return to her home county immediately, as her legal status as a widow is unverified. Her current living arrangement with an unrelated male is deemed improper and unsanctioned. The words fell like silverware on a table, cold and deliberate, meant to clear away every trace of decency that didn't fit within a line on a form. Jed didn't speak. He set the shovel down, so gently only the dust stirred. No clang, no fuss. Marion looked the man squarely in the face, but said nothing. She stood tall, soap still on her hands, the smell of hearth ash and dry hay still clinging to her sleeves. The whole homestead was still. Only the wind moved, brushing through the trees behind the house. Even the brittle grass seemed to bend in recognition, like it had seen this scene before, where loud words and legal papers made people forget someone had once survived on kindness that never needed a signature. The man stepped forward, held out the paper, as if getting a name scrawled on the bottom would end it all. Jed didn't take the paper. He only asked, slowly, "Do you want to go?" Marion didn't answer right away. After a long pause, she shook her head. No explanation, no pleading, just a firm shake from someone who had once been pulled away without being asked, and was now choosing, finally, to stay on her own 2 feet. The man from Carson frowned, ready to speak again, but Jed had already turned away, walking back toward the porch, not to avoid, but to write something in his own language. Part 10. He didn't propose. He just asked, "Need someone to sign." Evening came light as ash after a fire burned low. Jed sat at the old wooden table, turning over the same parchment he used to record cattle births, blacksmith appointments, or the price of oats from the town past the ridge. The paper edges were soft, the quill coarse. Ink turned more brown than black. No roses, no ring, just a few lines, written slower than usual, but without ornament. I, Jedediah Harper, do witness before this land, these skies, and my own conscience, that from this day forth I will shelter, share bread, and stand beside Marion Hill and her children as a husband and father would if he were still alive. Not a vow, just a statement of what felt right. Jed folded the paper, tucked it into the inside pocket of his worn leather coat, then stepped out onto the porch, eyes meeting Marion's as she chopped greens for the chickens. He asked like someone asking about the weather, "Need a preacher's signature? You coming with me?" Marion looked up. Afternoon light touching, her cheek boned. She wiped her hands on her apron, didn't speak, didn't refuse. A nod too soft to hear, but enough to send him on his way. Jed saddled his old gray horse, the one with scars down its back from hauling salt in Montana. He rode slow, not because there was time, but because he kept looking back toward the house. He didn't turn in the saddle, didn't wave, but each hoofbeat down the dirt road was a quiet promise. I'll be back. Not to say I love you, but to make what we're already living recognized. On the way to town, the wind tugged at his coat. The sky stayed still. No one knew this was a wedding day, no flowers, no hymns, just an old man with a curved back heading toward the oldest preacher in the county, the same one he helped re-roof after the last big storm, not because he needed a ceremony, but because if a witness was required, he wanted one who knew some things don't live on paper, but they're true just the same. Part 11. No vows were spoken, but 6 children laughed. The wedding took place the next noon, if one could call it that. No church bells, no gathering crowds, no tears of joy. Just a patch of dry earth behind the house, where the old chicken coop used to be, now swept clean, dry, shaded by the sapodilla tree Jed refused to cut down, even when folks told him it was only good for firewood. Marion wore an old cream-colored dress, the kind sewn for a Christmas 10 years past. It had been dusted off and mended by hand. No veil, no heels, just bare feet on soft dirt. The breeze lifted her hem slightly, as if the air itself knew this moment needed gentleness, not grandeur. Jed wore nothing new, but he'd combed his hair, washed his face thoroughly, and put on the white shirt he hadn't touched in years. His boots were half-shined, and his eyes, though quiet, spoke more clearly than any letter ever written. The preacher was the old man Jed had helped re-roof a year ago, after the storm. There were no rituals. He simply stood between them, opened a frayed Bible, read a few verses in a hoarse voice, then nodded. If you're staying beside each other, that's enough. Jed signed first. Marion followed. No rings, just a moment. Their hands brushed, not for long, but long enough for the children nearby to feel the air hold still. Caleb, the youngest, still struggling with the alphabet, stepped forward silently. He held out a bundle of dried grass, tied with a piece of twine. It looked like a bouquet, if you had the eyes of a child who still believed in such things. "For you, Ma," he whispered, then shuffled back, as if he feared he'd done something wrong. Marion didn't say a word. She only bowed low, then hugged the dried grass to her chest, as though holding all the things she had never dared to hope for. And then the most unexpected thing happened. Jesse, the eldest, the guarded one, the one who never let his guard slip, he laughed. Soft at first. Then Eli joined. Then Caleb, head tilted back, laughing loud, as if every sharp edge in his chest had just blown away in the wind. No one told them to, but the 6 children laughed, not because anything was funny, but because for the first time they were standing in a moment that didn't threaten to scatter them again. They were witnessing something that didn't need defining, only staying. Part 12. That night, no one called out, but everyone knew where they belonged. The wedding supper looked much like any other, except for the tablecloth Marion had pulled from the bottom of her chest. It was worn thin, the edges frayed, but it smelled of old memories, maybe of the house she once had, or the years when she still believed in parties. Jed sat at the head of the table, as he always did. Beside him, Jesse, still watchful, but not staring down at his plate for the first time. Caleb, the youngest, insisted on sitting next to Ma instead of between his brothers, and Marion smiled, said nothing, but didn't move him either. No one mentioned the wedding. No one brought up signatures or the preacher who left before sunset. No toasts, no speeches, but something in the air had changed. Soft and sure, like mist slipping through old wooden walls at night. Present even when unnoticed. Eli was the first to stand. He stepped into the kitchen, grabbed a folded cloth, and carefully carried the cast-iron pot, still warm, back to the center of the table. Marion paused when she saw. Not because she was surprised, but because it was the first time one of the children had acted like the kitchen truly belonged to them. Jessie stayed seated for a moment, then spoke. A quiet story about a broken wagon wheel last year and how he'd tied it up with a strap cut from his boot. There was no punchline, but everyone listened like it was the best story they'd heard in ages. Marion poured the tea, hands trembling slightly but steady enough. She poured for Jed first, without looking at him, then for each child. Caleb whispered, "Mom makes better tea," then grinned. Marion didn't answer. She only ran her hand gently through his messy hair, like she'd done it 100 times before. Jed didn't do much. He just sat there, watching every face, every motion, every small hand gripping a spoon as if it had always belonged at that table. It had been a long time since a night felt less like something to forget pain, and more like something meant to remind a man that life could still go on, if enough silence was filled by presence. Outside, the wind brushed the porch beams, carrying the scent of cold dirt and the soft rustle of horses chewing hay in the dark. And inside, there was firelight, and steam from tea, and bowls of food, and 6 people who now knew, without needing to ask, they weren't wandering anymore. Part 13. A wooden horse whittled from dry branch. The hands were clumsy but honest. October was near. The cottonwoods were turning, deep yellow leaves falling one by one, as if the wind itself had grown tired. Each morning frost laced the fence rails. Marion took longer to dry the laundry. Jed lit the stove earlier than any year before. That morning, Eli didn't follow his brothers to the field. He sat on the porch early, holding a dry branch he'd picked up yesterday, while clearing the barn's edge. The stick was rough, slightly mottled, bent just enough, its curve like the neck of a beast, a shape a small blade could follow without slipping. He carved slowly without any real aim, just one scrape after another, shaving off the bumps, then the layer beneath, until a vague shape of a horse began to emerge. It wasn't quite right, the head too large, the legs uneven, but the ears tilted back, and the mane curved just so, as if echoing something Eli had wanted to keep. No one asked what he was doing. Jessie glanced, then walked on. Marion passed by the kitchen door, glanced once, then quietly placed a small screw on the table, as if to remind him that the horse would need something to stand on if he wanted it to last. By late afternoon, Eli stood at the kitchen door, the carved figure wrapped in coarse cloth. He said nothing, just held it out, both hands trembling slightly but not letting go. Jed was chopping wood nearby. He saw, set the axe down, brushed sawdust from his palms, and walked over. He didn't reach out, just looked. The horse was rough, still unsanded. The saddle was a single knife gash across its belly. The tail leaned too far left, but when Jed laid his hand on its back, he didn't smile, didn't correct, didn't say, "Well done." He stroked once, from the mane to the tail, then turned, walked inside. On the mantel, beside the cooled ashes of the hearth, he placed the little horse upright, right next to a weathered stone he'd once picked from the hills out back, the one that marked the resting place of a long-dead dog. No thanks were spoken. He simply left it there, with the care one might give a thing worth keeping. Evening settled. The wind softened. The hens tucked themselves in early. Caleb rested his head on Marion's lap with a picture book. Jesse adjusted the latch on the barn gate. No one said a word about the wooden horse. But when Eli passed the porch, head slightly bowed, hands in his pockets, Marion gently touched his shoulder, just once. No questions, no praise, but in her eyes, for the first time, Eli saw something that told him he was enough to be remembered. Part 14. No one said family, but that morning everyone woke early to cook for each other. The sun hadn't yet risen. Light lingered behind the mountain ridges, just a faint streak of blue-violet across the horizon. On the porch, dew fell like drops from sleeping breath. The wind hadn't stirred, but in the small wooden house at the edge of Wind Hollow, the fire had already caught. Jed woke not to his own stirring, but to the sound of crackling logs, not lit by his hand. He stepped into the kitchen barefoot, shirt still unbuttoned, feet chilled from the floor. Jesse was hunched near the stove, tongs in hand like a seasoned fireman. Eli was at the back door, loading dry wood into a basket, already up for some time. Marion stood at the counter, sleeves rolled, hair knotted loosely, kneading bread dough without glancing up. Yet she knew Jed was at the doorway. Matthew sat on the tall stool, one hand gripping a tin cup, the other holding a small wooden knife, the one Jed had once carved as a young man, now used by the boy to slice butter. No one gave orders. No one asked what to do. Each simply moved, as if they'd always known their part. As if this morning was both the first time and the 100th they'd done this together. Jed walked to the table, picked up his usual tin cup. Marion poured him fresh coffee. He sat down, eyes scanning the room, then resting on the youngest, hair still tousled, eyes puffy with sleep. Matthew took a sip of milk, then looked up, voice still thick with drowsiness, but clear. "Pa, can you tell the part where the horse comes back?" No one laughed. No one teased. But Jesse and Eli caught each other's eyes. A small nod passed between them, enough for Matthew to know he hadn't asked something silly. Jed set his cup down, nodded once, slow and solid. "All right." Just one word. But it was enough. Outside, the wind began to stir. Sparrows gathered on the fence rails. The smell of rising bread drifted through the house, settling into the old wooden seams like it had always belonged. No one said family, but from that morning on, no one needed to. No one promised to stay, but they did out here, in this land of dust and wind. Folks are used to loss the way they're used to gunpowder, but sometimes it doesn't take a bullet or a vow to make people stay. No one in that wooden house ever used the word family. They just lit the fire, broke bread, listened to the horses breathe at night. Jed no longer set out 6 spoons on the table, because now each morning someone else would quietly place a spoon for the person beside them. A small thing, but sometimes it's the things left unspoken that let life begin again. If you've ever seen yourself in Jesse's eyes, cautious, unsure how to trust again, or in Marion's hands, trembling but trying to be steady. If you've ever made breakfast for someone who no longer sat at the table, then maybe you already understand this. We don't need to be saved by grand promises. We just need someone who's willing to stay, while we're still learning how to believe again. And if you've made it here, still with us, still reading this story, we don't need you to say much, just one word in the comments. Still here. That'll be enough to let us know you, too, just walked through something alongside us.